The compensatory mechanisms held for months, calendar managed, meetings massed through, conversations scripted before they happened, tasks completed, I barely, late, with more effort than anyone could see. And then one morning, the adaptive capacity becomes overwhelmed. Not a bad day, not a post project crash, not tiredness, a weekend will fix. The system that maintained function fails entirely. The person who was barely holding together can no longer begin. This isn't the burnout your neurotypical colleagues experience when they work too many hours. This is something else entirely. And understanding the difference could change how you see exhaustion itself. When most people hear burnout, they picture the same thing: someone who worked too hard for too long, hit a wall, and needs a vacation. The Maslach Burnout Inventory, developed by Christina Maslach in the early 1980s, gave us the standard definition: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced sense of personal accomplishment, typically from chronic workplace stress. Take some time off, set better boundaries, maybe switch jobs, problem solved. But this model was built studying neurotypical brains in neurotypical environments. And when you have ADHD, the math changes completely. Koutsimani and colleagues published a meta-analysis in the Journal of Attention Disorders in 2019, analyzing data from over 2,000 adults across multiple studies. They found that adults with ADHD consistently showed higher levels of burnout across all three Maslach dimensions compared to neurotypical controls, with executive function deficits serving as a significant mediating factor. In plain language, it's not just that people with ADHD burn out more, it's that the mechanism itself appears to be different. The seductive thing about the standard burnout model is that it feels like it should apply universally. Stress plus overwork equals exhaustion, right? But when your brain requires constant compensation just to function in a neurotypical world, when every social interaction demands a performance, when your nervous system runs hot from sensory input that others barely notice, the equation has different variables entirely. This is why so many people with ADHD find themselves frustrated when well-meaning friends suggest they just need better work-life balance. It's why taking a vacation doesn't restore them the way it does others. It's why they can feel burnt out even when their workload seems manageable to outside observers. The burnout isn't just happening at work, it's happening everywhere, all the time, from the simple act of existing in a world not built for their brains. To understand ADHD burnout, consider how the prefrontal cortex manages executive functions like a conductor, directing an orchestra. In neurotypical brains, this conductor has reliable musicians who respond predictably to direction. In ADHD brains, the conductor must work significantly harder. Some musicians need repeated cues, others play too loudly or too softly, and the conductor must constantly compensate to produce coherent music. This compensatory effort is metabolically expensive. Barclay's research suggests that ADHD represents primarily a deficit in behavioral inhibition and self-regulation rather than attention per se, though this remains one theoretical framework among several competing models in the field. His work indicates that the ADHD brain operates with fundamental differences in executive function networks, requiring the prefrontal cortex to work overtime managing working memory, inhibiting impulses, and shifting between tasks. Every day, this brain architecture burns extra cognitive fuel just to function at baseline. But here's where ADHD burnout diverges from the standard model. It's not just about cognitive load. It's about what clinicians observe as chronic compensatory effort, the constant energy expenditure of adapting to neurotypical environments and expectations. This ongoing regulatory load means the ADHD brain is constantly running translation processes, converting its natural operating patterns into something the neurotypical world can interface with. Think of it like this. If a neurotypical brain operates like a well-tuned engine running on the fuel it was designed for, the ADHD brain operates like that same engine running on a different fuel mixture. It can perform, sometimes even perform well, but the internal combustion process requires constant adjustments and produces more metabolic byproducts. Castellanos and Proal published neuroimaging findings in Trends in Cognitive Sciences in 2012, showing that ADHD brains demonstrate altered connectivity in the default mode network, the neural circuit active during rest, where neurotypical brains show efficient deactivation during focused tasks and organized activity during rest. ADHD brains show persistent interference between these networks. The mental processes don't idle efficiently. Layer onto this what clinical observations describe as rejection-sensitive dysphoria, a heightened sensitivity to perceived criticism or rejection that appears to affect many adults with ADHD. Every social interaction carries additional emotional weight. Every mistake feels amplified. The nervous system stays in a state of hypervigilance that neurotypical burnout models simply don't account for. The result is what we might call a compound burnout, the standard exhaustion from overwork, plus the exhaustion from constant adaptation, plus the exhaustion from emotional dysregulation, plus the exhaustion from sensory overstimulation, plus the exhaustion from executive function compensation. It's not just more burnout, it's burnout with additional layers that operate on different timescales and respond to different interventions. But here's where the science gets messy, and where intellectual honesty demands we acknowledge what we don't know. Much of what we call ADHD burnout isn't yet formally recognized in diagnostic manuals. The research is emerging, not established. Take the popular narrative about dopamine depletion. You'll see it everywhere online, and ADHD burnout happens because the brain's dopamine system gets depleted from overuse. It's a compelling story. Often the dopamine is involved in motivation and reward. ADHD involves dopamine dysregulation. Burnout involves loss of motivation. Connect the dots. But McDonald and colleagues at the University of Toronto published a comprehensive review in 2024 and found no peer-reviewed evidence for burnout-specific dopamine depletion in ADHD populations. The ADHD brain does have baseline differences in dopamine functioning, but whether burnout represents a further depletion state or something else entirely remains an open question. This matters because the intervention implications are different. If ADHD burnout is about dopamine depletion, the solution might be pharmacological, optimizing medication, adding supplements, targeting the neurotransmitter system directly. If it's about chronic regulatory load, the solution might be environmental, reducing adaptive demands, creating sensory-friendly spaces, building executive function supports. The truth is likely more complex than either narrative suggests. The replication crisis in psychology has taught us to be skeptical of neat, simple explanations for complex phenomena, and ADHD burnout is nothing if not complex. What we do know from clinical populations is telling. Autistic individuals who share some executive function and sensory processing similarities with ADHD populations show what researchers call autistic burnout, a distinct phenomenon that involves skill regression, increased sensory sensitivity, and withdrawal from social engagement. Raymaker and colleagues at Portland State University documented this in 2020, showing that autistic burnout looks different from occupational burnout in both presentation and recovery patterns. Similarly, people with ADHD and burnout often don't just look tired, they look different. Dr. Floriana Reinicus, a clinical psychologist specializing in neurodivergence, notes that while neurotypical burnout tends to slow people down, ADHD burnout can paradoxically involve continued hyperactivity and restlessness. The person looks busy, maybe even productive, while internally experiencing complete depletion. This creates diagnostic confusion. Standard burnout assessments might miss ADHD burnout entirely, interpreting the continued activity as evidence that the person isn't actually burnt out. Meanwhile, the person themselves might not recognize their state as burnout because it doesn't match the cultural narrative of someone who's too tired to function. So what does this mean for how you understand your own exhaustion, or that of someone you care about? If you have ADHD, your relationship with burnout is fundamentally different from your neurotypical peers. The advice that works for them, banquets, take a vacation, set boundaries, practice self-care, might help, but it won't address the underlying drivers. You're not failing at recovery, you're trying to solve a different equation with the wrong formula. The constant adaptation is real and it's costly. Every meeting where you force yourself to sit still, every conversation where you script your responses to seem normal, every time you suppress a fidget or hide your need for stimulation, all of that has a cumulative cost that doesn't appear on any productivity metric. Recognizing this isn't making excuses, it's acknowledging reality. This also means that prevention looks different. For neurotypical individuals, burnout prevention might focus on workload management and stress reduction. For ADHD individuals, it might focus on authenticity, finding environments where adaptive demands are lower, building support systems that understand neurodivergent needs, and developing self-advocacy skills. Recovery looks different too. Rest alone rarely resolves ADHD burnout because the underlying drivers, the need for constant adaptation, the sensory environment, the the executive function demands, remain unchanged when you return to your regular environment. True recovery might require environmental modifications, relationship changes, or even career pivots that reduce the chronic regulatory load. If you're supporting someone with ADHD who seems burnt out, resist the urge to offer standard burnout advice. You just need a break might be well intentioned, but it can feel invalidating when the person knows that breaks don't fix the fundamental mismatch between their brain and their environment. Instead, ask what specific supports might reduce their daily cognitive load. Could meetings be shorter? Could they have written agendas in advance? Could they work in a quieter space? Could deadlines be more flexible? These aren't accommodations for weakness. They're adjustments that recognize different neurological operating systems. ADHD burnout isn't neurotypical burnout with the volume turned up. It's a qualitatively different phenomenon with different causes, different presentations, and different recovery needs. It's what happens when a brain that already works harder to navigate the world reaches the limits of its compensatory capacity. Understanding this distinction isn't just academic, it's practical. It means that the exhaustion you feel isn't a character flaw or a failure of willpower. It's the predictable result of running complex neurological processes on architecture that requires more energy and produces more metabolic overhead. And recognizing that difference is the first step toward finding solutions that actually work for the brain you have, not the brain the world expects you to have.